The marble steps beneath her bare feet had grown cold in the pre-dawn darkness. Livia Drusilla pressed her palm against the limestone wall of the imperial villa, feeling the rough texture bite into her skin as the muffled sounds of her husband's rage echoed through the corridors behind her. The acrid smell of burning oil from the wall sconces mixed with the metallic taste of blood on her split lip. A reminder of the price of speaking when not spoken to. Her fingers traced the fresh bruise along her collarbone, hidden beneath the carefully draped stola that would soon fool the senators' wives at morning court. The heavy wool felt like armour against skin that had learned to flinch at unexpected touch. In the courtyard below, a slave girl no older than 14 stumbled past the fountain, a torn tunic telling its own silent story of the night's violence. The footsteps grew closer. Livia straightened her shoulders, arranged the fold of her garment to conceal the evidence, and painted the expected smile across her face. When the heavy oak door creaked open behind her, she had already transformed herself back into the perfect Roman matron, silent, obedient, invisible in plain sight. The morning sun crested the 7 hills, casting long shadows across an empire built on the broken backs of half its population. In every villa, in every household, behind every marble facade, the same scene played out in countless variations. The women of Rome had learned to wear their suffering like jewellery, beautiful, ornamental, and utterly constraining. What the histories would not record, what the poets would never sing, what the philosophers would never debate, was about to unfold in the intimate spaces where power revealed its truest face. The empire that ruled the world had made slaves of its own daughters, wives, and mothers, and they had learned to smile while their spirits died. The Forum Romanum at dawn belonged to the men. Their voices carried across the marble colonnades as senators debated grain distributions and provincial taxes, their togas billowing in the morning breeze like the wings of carrion birds circling fresh meat. The clatter of hobnailed sandals on stone echoed against the temple walls as merchants and magistrates began their daily dance of power and profit. But in the shadows of the great columns, another world stirred to life. Slave women hauled amphorae of oil and wine from the markets, their shoulders already bent from years of carrying burdens too heavy for their frames. Their masters' daughters walked past in carefully orchestrated processions, surrounded by attendants whose primary function was not protection but surveillance. The house of Marcus Crassus Dives stretched along the Palatine Hill like a sleeping beast, its marble walls inlaid with gold and precious stones looted from a dozen conquered provinces. Within its courtyards, 3 generations of women moved through their morning rituals with the precision of a military. Campaign the Mater Familias, Claudia Pulchra, supervised the household with an iron hand that concealed fingers permanently stained with the purple dye of bruises that never quite healed. Her daughter-in-law Octavia, barely 18 and married since her 14th birthday, knelt before the lararium offering prayers to gods who had never answered a woman's plea for mercy. The household gods stared down from their painted alcove with expressions as cold and distant as the men who ruled their flesh and blood devotees. Octavia's hands trembled as she placed the offering of bread and honey, not from reverence, but from the exhaustion that came from spending another sleepless night fulfilling her conjugal duties to a husband who treated her body like a battleground to be conquered nightly. The younger girls of the household, daughters, nieces and wards, sat in the morning light working their spinning wheels, their fingers moving with mechanical precision learned through years of correction. A dropped thread meant a slap across the face. A poorly woven section meant an hour kneeling on the cold marble floor. Their tutor, an aging Greek slave named Philemon, watched them with eyes that had witnessed too many young spirits broken on the wheel of Roman propriety. "A woman's virtue," he recited in his carefully modulated voice, "lies in her silence, her obedience, and her fertility." The girls repeated the words in unison, their voices flat and lifeless as the funeral masks that lined the atrium walls. In the kitchen courtyard, the female slaves began their preparations for the day's meals. Their calloused hands moved swiftly through tasks that would continue until long after sunset, grinding grain, stoking fires, hauling water from the cistern. The kitchen supervisor, a freedwoman named Ilia, who had earned her liberty through 20 years of servitude, distributed the day's beatings with the same methodical efficiency she applied to distributing bread rations. The youngest kitchen slave, a Gallic girl named Brenia, who could not have seen more than 12 winters, bore fresh welts across her back from yesterday's lesson in proper deference. She moved like a wounded animal, flinching at sudden sounds, her blue eyes holding the hollow stare of someone whose spirit had learned to retreat deep inside itself to survive. The legal reality was carved into Roman law as permanently as the inscriptions on their tombstones. A woman possessed no legal identity separate from her male guardian. She could not own property, could not make contracts, could not appear in court except as evidence to be examined. The pater familias held the power of life and death over every female in his household, wives, daughters, slaves, and freed women alike. Marriage was a transaction conducted between men, with the woman as the commodity exchanged for political alliance or financial advantage. The wedding ceremony itself told the story. The bride was literally handed from her father to her husband, like a valuable amphora changing ownership. The traditional wedding cry of Thalassius echoed through Roman streets not as celebration, but as the sound of another young woman disappearing into legal non-existence. In the houses of the wealthy, marriage contracts specified the bride's dowry down to the last bronze coin and described her reproductive obligations with the clinical precision of a livestock breeding agreement. A woman who failed to produce sons faced divorce, disgrace, and destitution. Those who produced only daughters were scorned as failures, their worth measured by their ability to manufacture the next generation of Roman citizens, always male, always valuable, always belonging to someone else. The morning ritual of the salutatio demonstrated the hierarchy in its purest form. Clients and dependents gathered in the atrium to pay their respects to the master of the house, seeking favours, loans, or legal protection. The women of the household were present, but invisible, their role limited to standing silently behind their male relatives like living furniture arranged for decoration. When important business was discussed, they retreated to the women's quarters, the gymnasium, where they could spin wool and gossip about the only subjects deemed appropriate for female conversation: children, servants, and the management of household supplies. The more intelligent among them learned to listen at doorways and piece together fragments of overheard conversation, building their understanding of politics and finance like archaeologists reconstructing a lost civilization from pottery shards. Education for girls ended at puberty, if it began at all. While their brothers studied rhetoric, philosophy, and law in preparation for public careers, daughters learned domestic skills and the intricate art of silent submission. They memorized genealogies not to understand history, but to know which bloodlines produced the most valuable marriage alliances. They studied literature only to better appreciate the poets who celebrated female virtue through stories of women who chose death over dishonor. The bathhouses of Rome revealed another layer of the systematic subjugation. In the women's sections, bodies told stories that voices were forbidden to speak. Scars from whippings crisscrossed backs and shoulders. Badly healed bone breaks created permanent limps and twisted limbs. The hollow eyes and gaunt frames of women who had borne child after child in service to their husbands' dynastic ambitions. Even among the privileged classes, pregnancy was a death sentence disguised as a blessing. Roman medicine understood little about childbirth, beyond the observation that many women died during the process. Those who survived multiple births often suffered internal injuries that left them in chronic pain for the remainder of their lives. Yet refusing their husbands' advances was not merely forbidden, it was literally impossible. Under Roman law, which granted men unlimited sexual access to their wives as a property right, the religious festivals that punctuated the Roman calendar offered the only glimpse of what female power might have looked like in a different world. During the Bona Dea festival, men were forbidden from the sacred precinct, while women conducted mysterious rites that even the most diligent historians could never fully penetrate. For one night each year, the matrons of Rome gathered without male supervision, speaking words and performing acts that belonged exclusively to themselves. But even these moments of apparent freedom carried their own constraints. The rituals themselves focused on fertility and domestic harmony, prayers for successful childbirth, for obedient children, for husbands who would not beat them too severely. Even in their most sacred spaces, Roman women were permitted to exist only in relation to the men who owned them. The sun reached its zenith above the Seven Hills, casting sharp shadows across the marble monuments that celebrated Roman conquest and Roman virtue. In every shadow, women moved through their prescribed roles with the mechanical precision of well-trained dancers, performing a choreography written by others, for others, without them. The empire stretched from Britain to Egypt, from Spain to Syria, but within the walls of every Roman house, the same drama played out daily. The systematic erasure of female will, female voice, female existence as anything more than a vessel for male ambition. They were the invisible foundation upon which the visible world was built, supporting a civilization that had elevated the denial of their humanity to the level of religious doctrine. The villa of Senator Gaius Cornelius Tacitus held secrets that would never appear in his celebrated histories. Behind the public rooms where he entertained fellow senators and visiting dignitaries lay a network of chambers connected by narrow corridors that servants used to move unseen through the house. But these passages served another purpose, one that transformed the respectable Roman home into something far more sinister. In the basement beneath the kitchen, stone cells no larger than burial niches held the household's female slaves during their training periods. The walls bore scratches made by fingernails worn down to bloody stumps, desperate attempts to mark the passage of days in perpetual darkness. The iron rings embedded in the stone had worn smooth from the constant friction of chains, and the floor bore stains that decades of scrubbing could never fully erase. Domina Livia Cornelius descended these steps each morning with the casual air of a gardener tending her plants. In her hands, she carried the tools of her trade. Leather whips soaked in salt water to maximize pain while preventing fatal wounds, iron brands heated in the kitchen fires above, and small glass vials filled with substances that would ensure compliance through chemical means, rather than mere physical force. The newest acquisition, a Germanic girl captured during the latest campaign beyond the Rhine, pressed herself against the far corner of her cell as Livia approached. The girl's blonde hair had been shorn close to her scalp, not for cleanliness, but to remove any vestige of the identity she had possessed before becoming Roman property. Her pale skin already bore the systematic markings that would teach her the precise boundaries of her new existence. Resistance, Livia explained to her daughter Claudia, who observed these lessons with the clinical detachment of a medical student studying anatomy, must be broken completely before it becomes habit. A slave who learns to say no in small matters will eventually say no in large ones. The Germanic girl's eyes followed their movements with the desperate alertness of a trapped animal. She had not yet learned that watching too intently was itself a punishable offence, that even the direction of her gaze now belonged to others. The leather whip cut through the air with a sound like tearing silk, and another lesson in Roman civilization began. Above these chambers, in rooms perfumed with frankincense and decorated with frescoes depicting mythological scenes of divine rape transformed into romantic seduction, the wives and daughters of Rome's elite participated in their own forms of systematic brutalization. The morning beauty rituals that prepared them for public appearance resembled religious ceremonies dedicated to the worship of male approval. Octavia submitted to her cosmetic torture with the resignation of a martyr approaching the flames. Her personal slave, a Syrian girl named Miriam, applied the face paint that would disguise the previous night's violence. White lead powder covered the bruised cheekbone where her husband's signet ring had left its mark. Kohl-rimmed eyes that had learned never to meet a man's gaze directly, lest such boldness invite correction. Rouge-stained lips that spoke only when spoken to, and then only in the soft, submissive tones that Roman men found pleasing in their women. The transformation was complete when the stola was arranged to conceal the rope burns around her wrists, souvenirs from the previous evening's martial duties that had involved restraints and practices that would have been considered criminal assault had the victim been male or the perpetrator of lower social rank. But within the sacred bonds of Roman marriage, no act was too degrading to be legally permissible, provided it served the husband's pleasure or the household's reproductive goals. In the women's quarters, conversations took place in coded language developed over generations of enforced silence. A mention of headaches referred to the after effects of being strangled into unconsciousness during forced encounters. Difficulty walking indicated internal injuries from objects or acts that pushed the boundaries of what the human body could endure. Monthly troubles could mean anything from deliberately induced miscarriages to infections resulting from unsanitary violations. The elderly matron Claudia Pultra presided over these discussions with the authority of a general briefing his officers before battle. She had survived 40 years of marriage to a man whose political career required the appearance of domestic harmony while permitting private practices that would have shocked even Rome's most depraved criminals. Her knowledge of herbal abortifacients, pain-numbing compounds, and methods for concealing physical evidence had been passed down through 3 generations of women who had learned that survival depended on absolute secrecy. "The silphium," she whispered to her daughter-in-law while grinding seeds in a marble mortar, "must be taken within 2 days, or it loses its effectiveness. Mix it with wine if you can manage it, but honeyed water will serve if wine cannot be obtained without suspicion." The younger woman's hands shook as she accepted the small leather pouch that contained both salvation and damnation. Salvation from unwanted pregnancy, damnation if discovered practicing the forbidden art of controlling her own reproduction. The religious colleges that governed Rome's spiritual life had developed elaborate theological justifications for practices that reduced half the population to the status of sacred livestock. The cult of Vesta, which required its priestesses to maintain absolute chastity for 30 years of service, was celebrated as the pinnacle of female virtue. But the selection process revealed the true nature of this honour. Young girls were chosen not for their spiritual calling, but to remove them from the marriage market and prevent certain bloodlines from reproducing. Those who broke their vows faced execution by being buried alive in underground chambers specifically constructed for this purpose. The ritual was performed with elaborate ceremony, as if the murder of women who had dared to exercise sexual autonomy was itself a form of divine worship. The surviving Vestals learned to police each other with the desperate vigilance of prisoners who knew that someone must die to satisfy the god's appetite for female suffering. In the private villa schools where wealthy families educated their children, a different form of systematic abuse flourished under the guise of moral instruction. Young girls learned proper comportment through physical correction that began with light switches for minor infractions and escalated to brandings and bone breaking for more serious failures of feminine virtue. The educational philosophy held that pain was the most effective teacher, and that a woman who had not learned to endure suffering with grace would fail in her primary function as a vessel for male pleasure and procreation. The pedagogue responsible for this instruction, a eunuch named Thessalus, who had been castrated as a child to ensure his suitability for supervising females, applied his lessons with the methodical precision of a master craftsman, shaping raw material into finished goods. His students learned to recite poetry while enduring increasingly elaborate torments, training their minds to separate from their bodies as a survival mechanism that would serve them throughout their adult lives. The medical practices of the time provided a veneer of scientific legitimacy for procedures that were indistinguishable from torture. Roman physicians had developed sophisticated theories about female anatomy that justified the most invasive and painful interventions as necessary for women's health. Hysteria, a condition diagnosed whenever a woman displayed any form of independent thought or emotional complexity, required treatments that involved the systematic violation of bodily autonomy under the guise of medical necessity. The surgical instruments discovered in Pompey's buried hospitals tell their own story of institutionalized sadism disguised as healing. Specula, designed to cause maximum discomfort during examination. Cauterization irons used to correct female anatomy that was deemed insufficiently pleasing to male sensibilities. Restraining devices that held patients immobile during procedures performed without any form of pain relief, because physicians believed that women's suffering during medical treatment was both natural and spiritually beneficial. The gladiatorial games, celebrated throughout the empire as the pinnacle of Roman entertainment, included female participants whose presence in the arena served purposes that extended far beyond mere spectacle. Women condemned to death for crimes against the state, which could include anything from adultery to practicing foreign religions, were subjected to elaborate public executions designed to provide both entertainment and education about the consequences of female disobedience. These events were carefully choreographed to maximize both physical and psychological torment. Female prisoners were often required to fight wild beasts while naked, their vulnerability serving as a reminder to female spectators about what awaited those who challenged male authority. The crowd's enthusiasm for such spectacles revealed a society that had elevated the public humiliation and destruction of women to the level of religious festival. As the afternoon sun cast longer shadows through the villa's courtyards, the day's lessons continued in chambers that archaeologists would never excavate and historians would never document. The screams that echoed through the marble corridors were absorbed by stone walls, built thick enough to contain any sound that might disturb the neighbours' afternoon rest. The empire's subjects in distant provinces would never learn of these intimate practices, but they would feel their effects through policies and laws that extended Rome's particular form of civilization to every corner of the known world. The systematic brutalization of women was not a byproduct of imperial power. It was its very foundation, the bedrock upon which all other forms of domination were constructed. The plague arrived in Rome during the consulship of Marcus Aurelius, but its origins lay not in the distant battlefields of Germania or the trade routes from Alexandria. It festered first in the basements and hidden chambers where the empire's darkest practices had taken root, spreading upward through the marble corridors like poison seeping through cracked foundations. The first victims were not the slaves in their underground cells, though death would have been a mercy for many of them. Instead, the contagion struck at the heart of Rome's ruling families, manifesting not as fever or pustules, but as a madness that drove the perpetrators of systematic cruelty to turn their violence inward upon themselves and each other. Senator Gaius Cornelius Tacitus was discovered in his study at dawn, his own stylus driven through his throat with sufficient force to pin him to the wax tablet on which he had been recording the household's daily punishments. The tablet bore a single word, carved deep into the wax with the desperation of a dying man's final confession: vengeance. His wife, Domina Livia, had vanished during the night, leaving behind only the leather whips and iron brands that had been her instruments of control, now arranged in the basement chambers like offerings on a funeral altar. The household slaves found the doors to their cells standing open, the keys scattered across the stone floor like seeds cast by a careless farmer. The Germanic girl emerged from her confinement transformed. The terror that had filled her blue eyes had crystallized into something harder and more dangerous. A clarity of purpose that came from having survived the absolute depths of human cruelty, and discovered that death held no fear for someone who had already experienced worse than dying. She moved through the villa with the systematic efficiency of a general conducting a siege, gathering the other female slaves and freedwomen who had suffered under the regime of sanctified torture that Roman law had made not merely legal, but virtuous. They did not speak as they worked. Words were unnecessary among those who had shared the same degradation, the same hopelessness, the same transformation from human beings into instruments for others' pleasure. The fire began in the basement chambers where so much suffering had occurred, but it was not the wild, destructive blaze of mindless revenge. Instead, it burned with the controlled intensity of a ritual purification, consuming the instruments of torment while leaving the stone walls standing as monuments to what had transpired within them. Throughout the Palatine Hill, similar scenes unfolded with the synchronicity of a carefully orchestrated revolution. The wives and daughters of Rome's elite, who had seemed to accept their subjugation with the resignation of domestic animals, revealed that their silence had concealed not submission, but preparation. Octavia stood in the atrium of her husband's house, watching the flames consume the marriage bed where she had endured countless nights of legalized assault. The fire reflected in her dark eyes like stars in a night sky, but her face showed no expression beyond the careful blankness that Roman women had perfected as a survival mechanism. Her husband's body lay in the impluvium, the shallow pool designed to catch rainwater from the roof. But it was not rain that had filled the basin with crimson liquid, and Marcus Brutus Calvus would never again exercise his legal right to treat his wife's body as conquered territory, to be claimed and reclaimed at will. The medical scrolls that had provided scientific justification for the systematic brutalization of women burned in the great library of Trajan. The surgical instruments designed to cause maximum pain during unnecessary procedures melted in braziers that had once heated the brands used to mark slave women as property. The records of the gladiatorial schools revealed the true scope of the empire's appetite for female suffering. Thousands of women had been fed to the arena not for crimes against the state, but for the crime of existing in bodies that Roman men found useful for entertainment, as well as exploitation. The accounting scrolls listed them like livestock. Germanic blonde, untrained, good for beast fights. Gallic brunette, some combat experience, suitable for longer spectacles. Syrian dancer, exotic appearance, reserve for special occasions. These documents burned alongside the others, their smoke rising above the 7 hills like incense offered to gods who had finally grown tired of accepting human sacrifice as worship. The Vestal virgins emerged from their sacred precinct for the first time in living memory, abandoning their temple duties to walk through the burning streets of Rome. Their white robes had been stained with soot and blood, but they moved with the authority of priestesses reclaiming their proper role as guardians of the sacred flame. Not the tame fire that had burned in their temple hearth, but the wild blaze that was now consuming the structures of oppression throughout the city. The youngest among them, barely 12 years old when she had been selected for a lifetime of enforced chastity, carried in her small hands the skull of her predecessor, the Vestal who had been buried alive for the crime of falling in love. She had dug up the remains with her own fingers, and now she held them aloft like a battle standard as she led her sisters through streets that reeked of smoke and justice. The foreign slaves who had been brought to Rome from the empire's furthest provinces spoke in languages that their masters had tried to beat out of them, but which had survived in whispered conversations during the brief moments when surveillance relaxed. Now these suppressed tongues filled the air with the sound of liberation, not the Latin words that had been forced into their mouths, but the ancient syllables that carried the names of gods who demanded no human sacrifice, no female suffering, no systematic brutalization disguised as civilization. The Germanic girl who had emerged from Senator Tacitus's basement had become something more than human and less than human simultaneously. A living embodiment of the violence that had been done to countless others, transformed into an instrument of cosmic rebalancing that operated beyond the reach of human law or divine mercy. She stood in the Forum Romanum as the sun reached its zenith, surrounded by the marble monuments to Roman conquest and Roman virtue that were now revealed as tombstones marking the graves of murdered civilizations. The bronze tablets that recorded Rome's laws lay scattered at her feet, their metal surface reflecting the flames that consumed the Curia, where senators had crafted legislation to legitimize atrocity. The imperial palaces on the Palatine Hill burned with a fire that could be seen from the furthest suburbs of the city. Within those flames, the accumulated wealth of centuries. Gold stolen from Gallic tribes, silver looted from Hispanic mines, precious stones torn from the temples of conquered gods, melted into slag that would serve no purpose except to mark the spot where an empire had chosen to consume itself, rather than confront the truth of what it had become. The aqueducts that had carried fresh water to Roman bathhouses and Roman fountains now ran red with something other than water. The same engineering genius that had brought clear mountain streams to the 7 hills now carried a different kind of message through the city's veins. a reminder that blood spilled in secret chambers would eventually seep into the foundations and poison the entire structure. Citizens who had never questioned the systematic brutalization of half their population now found themselves confronting the physical evidence of what their civilization had required for its continuation. The marble facades that had concealed Rome's true nature cracked and fell away, revealing the infrastructure of torture and exploitation that had operated beneath the surface of respectability. Children discovered the remains of other children in the walls of buildings they had passed daily, without suspicion. Wives found evidence of their husbands' true natures, hidden in rooms they had been forbidden to enter. Fathers learned what their sons had been taught to consider normal masculine behaviour, in schools that advertised moral education while practicing systematic cruelty. The great libraries that had preserved the wisdom of Greece and the practical knowledge of Egypt became funeral pyres for a different kind of learning. The accumulated expertise in human suffering that Roman civilization had elevated to the level of high art. Scrolls containing detailed instructions for breaking the human spirit burned alongside philosophical treatises that had justified such practices as necessary for social order. As night fell over the burning city, the survivors gathered in spaces that had never before been used for public assembly. The ruins of private torture chambers, the remains of basement prisons, the ashes of buildings where law and medicine and religion had conspired to make suffering sacred. They did not speak of rebuilding. They did not plan for tomorrow. They simply stood witness to the end of a world that had sustained itself through the systematic destruction of those it deemed expendable. The empire that had conquered the known world had finally met an enemy it could not defeat. The accumulated weight of its own cruelty returned upon it with interest compounded over centuries of unpaid debt. 2 centuries later, when Christian scholars in Constantinople attempted to reconstruct the history of Rome's fall, they found themselves confronting gaps in the historical record that seemed to have been carved out with surgical precision. The official accounts spoke of barbarian invasions, economic collapse, and political instability, explanations that satisfied those who preferred their history sanitized of inconvenient truths. But in the margins of burnt manuscripts, in the spaces between official proclamations, in the archaeological silence of buildings that had simply vanished from the historical record, a different story whispered itself to those with eyes trained to see what was deliberately hidden. The Germanic girl whose name had never been recorded in any Roman document had become something unprecedented in the empire's long history of conquest and assimilation. She was neither citizen nor slave, neither foreign enemy nor domestic ally. She existed in the spaces between categories that Roman law had created to organize human existence, and in those spaces she had found a form of power that the empire's architects had never imagined possible. The survivors who had witnessed the burning of Rome carried with them fragments of memory that refused to conform to the official narratives being constructed by those who came after. An elderly freedwoman named Cassia, found decades later living in a cave system beneath what had once been the Forum Romanum, spoke in broken sentences about women who had learned to move through solid stone, who could appear and disappear at will, who seemed to exist partially in the world of the living and partially in some other realm where different laws governed what was possible. "She walks through walls," Cassia whispered to the Christian monk who discovered her hiding place. "She walks through walls, and she remembers everything, every scream, every name, every face. She carries them all inside her like a torch that never burns out." The monk, Brother Augustine, transcribed these words with hands that trembled not from old age, but from a recognition that struck him at some level deeper than conscious thought. In the caves beneath the ruined city, he found evidence of habitation that defied rational explanation. Living spaces carved from solid rock without tool marks. Chambers that seemed to exist in impossible geometric relationships to each other. Walls decorated with symbols that hurt the eyes to look upon directly. The artwork, if it could be called that, depicted scenes that no Roman artist would have dared to create and no Roman patron would have commissioned. Women in positions of power over men who cowered before them like beaten animals. Children standing triumphant over the corpses of their parents. Slaves wearing crowns while emperors crawled naked through filth. But the most disturbing images were those that seemed to show not what had happened, but what was still happening, in some parallel realm where the victims of Roman civilization continued to exist, continued to suffer, continued to demand justice that the historical world had proven incapable of providing. Brother Augustine sealed the cave entrance with stones blessed by 3 bishops and marked with every protective symbol known to Christian theology. But in his private journal, which would not be discovered until the 16th century, he wrote words that would haunt every scholar who encountered them. The debt remains unpaid. The creditors are still collecting, and they are not bound by the natural laws that govern the living and the dead. In the libraries of Alexandria, before the Great Fire consumed the ancient world's accumulated knowledge, a Jewish scholar named Philo made copies of certain Roman legal documents that had survived the burning of the Capitol. These texts contained references to judicial proceedings that had never been officially recorded, trials for crimes that Roman law had never recognized as existing. The fragmentary transcripts spoke of women who had appeared before tribunals that seemed to convene in the spaces between sleeping and waking, between past and present, between the world of flesh and some other realm where accountability operated according to different principles. The accused were Roman citizens of the highest standing: senators, generals, philosophers, emperors, charged with violations of laws that existed nowhere in any written code. The defendant, Marcus Brutus Calvus, stands accused of murder in the first degree. Read one partial transcript. The victims number 732, their names recorded in the Book of Blood that exists beyond the reach of human destruction. How does the defendant answer these charges? The responses were uniformly the same: confusion, denial, appeals to Roman law that held no jurisdiction in these impossible courts. But the verdicts were recorded with the stark finality of divine judgment. Guilty. Sentence to be carried out in the realm of eternal return, where the defendant shall experience precisely what was inflicted, for precisely as long as it was inflicted, with precisely the same degree of suffering caused. Philo's copies were hidden in sealed jars and buried in the desert, where they remained untouched until Bedouin treasure hunters discovered them in 1947, alongside scrolls that would reshape humanity's understanding of ancient religion and philosophy. But Philo's Roman documents were quietly removed from the cache and have never been publicly displayed in any museum or referenced in any scholarly publication. The Vatican's secret archives contain a single folio page, catalogued simply as Testimonium Mysterium, origin unknown. The text, written in Latin that shows signs of having been translated from some other language that left no other trace in the historical record, describes an encounter between Pope Gregory the Great and a figure whose description defies rational categorization. She appeared in our private chapel during the hour of prime, though no door had opened to admit her passage. Her form was that of a young woman, but her eyes contained multitudes, the faces of all who had suffered under the yoke of earthly authority, concentrated into a gaze that penetrated to the depths of the soul. She spoke no words, but her meaning was unmistakable. The Church's acceptance of temporal power came with obligations that extended far beyond the concerns of mortal politics. The Pope's account continues: "When I asked by what authority she made such claims, she smiled with an expression that contained more sorrow than anger, more patience than mercy. From the folds of her simple garment, she produced a scroll that bore the names of every woman who had died in childbirth while praying for the Church's protection, every child who had been beaten by Christian fathers exercising their divinely ordained authority, every slave who had accepted baptism while remaining in chains, blessed by Christian masters." The folio ends abruptly, with a note in different handwriting. His Holiness was discovered at dawn in a state of collapse. He spoke no word of explanation for his condition, and this account was found beneath his pillow, written in a hand that bore no resemblance to his own. The chapel remains sealed by papal decree. In the modern archaeological record, excavations of Roman sites consistently reveal anomalies that resist explanation within conventional historical frameworks. Basement chambers that appear to have been deliberately filled with concrete immediately before the empire's collapse, as if someone had wanted to ensure that certain spaces could never again be used for their original purposes. Human remains found in impossible positions, skeletons that seemed to have been reaching towards something that was no longer there when the bones were discovered, skulls that bear evidence of trauma that occurred after death, teeth marks on metal restraints that suggest forces far beyond normal human strength. Carbon dating of these sites produces results that contradict established chronologies, suggesting that some events recorded as having occurred in the distant past may have taken place much more recently than historical records indicate. Or perhaps, and this possibility troubles archaeologists far more than simple dating errors, time itself operates differently in these spaces, where the boundary between past and present has become permeable. Museum curators have learned not to display certain artifacts recovered from Roman sites, not because they are too fragile or too valuable, but because they produce effects on viewers that cannot be explained by rational means. Visitors report seeing movement in static sculptures, hearing voices from empty rooms, experiencing physical sensations of pain or terror that leave no visible marks but require medical attention. Security cameras in these restricted collections malfunction with disturbing regularity, their recordings showing images that cannot be accounted for by natural phenomena or human presence. Figures moving through locked rooms at night, shadows cast by objects that are not present during daylight hours, reflections in glass cases that show not the artifacts within, but scenes of violence that seem to be occurring in real time. The most troubling discovery occurred in 1963, during renovation of a Roman villa in Pompeii that had been sealed since the volcanic eruption. In a basement room that should have been filled with ash and volcanic debris, archaeologists found a space that appeared to have been recently occupied. Fresh scratches on the walls, organic matter that had not been fossilized by the eruption, and footprints in volcanic ash that led to a solid stone wall and simply stopped. The site was classified immediately and has never been opened to public viewing. The official report states that the room contained materials of uncertain provenance requiring further study, but the archaeologist who first entered the chamber, Dr. Elena Rossi, submitted a private report to her superiors that remained buried in university files until her death in 2019. "The room exists in a state of temporal suspension," she wrote. "The evidence suggests that the events that occurred within these walls are not historical in the conventional sense. They are ongoing, recurring, playing out in an eternal present that intersects with our world only at specific moments and under specific conditions. The victims of what happened here have not moved on to whatever afterlife awaits the dead. They remain trapped in the moment of their suffering, and that moment continues to exist parallel to our own timeline." Dr. Rossi's final entry in her private journal, dated the day before she was found dead in her hotel room from causes that medical examiners could never definitively establish, contained a single question that has haunted everyone who has read her work. If justice delayed is justice denied, what becomes of justice that is denied so completely that it creates its own form of time, its own form of space, its own form of reality where the moral debt can never be forgiven, because it can never be fully paid? The question hangs in the air above the ruins of empire like smoke from fires that burned out centuries ago, but somehow continue to smoulder in dimensions that exist parallel to the world of monuments and museums and carefully sanitized historical narratives. In every generation there are those who claim to have encountered her, the Germanic girl whose name was never recorded, whose suffering was never acknowledged, whose transformation into something beyond human categories continues to operate in the spaces between what is known and what is knowable. They describe eyes that contain multitudes, a presence that exists simultaneously in the past and the present, a form of justice that operates according to laws written in books that no human hand has ever opened. And they all ask the same question, though they phrase it differently depending on their century, their culture, their capacity to comprehend what cannot be comprehended. Who decides when a civilization has committed crimes so systematic, so fundamental to its very existence, that the normal processes of historical judgment become inadequate? And what happens to the victims whose suffering was so complete that death itself could not provide release from the injustice that created their pain? The question remains unanswered, echoing through the corridors of time like footsteps in an empty house where someone is always walking but never arrives.